Hello, I'm Jan Helge Solbakk, Professor of Medical Ethics at Center for Medical Ethics at the University of Oslo. Today, we are going to talk about medical and health-related research with particular emphasis on the situation in poor and low-income countries. And I'm going to focus on three important concepts: exploitation, collaborative injustice, and benefit sharing. So let's then start the lectures. Why is there a need for developing a sustainable ethics of benefit sharing in scientific research and development? I will provide you with two types of answers. First, some normative answers, that is, answers that relates to what should be done and why it should be done, and then some factual answers. Here is the first, normative answers. There is such a need for an ethics of benefit sharing because Article 15 of the Universal Declaration on Bioethics and Human Rights says so. All 192 member states of the United Nations have committed themselves to following the normative principles laid down in this declaration. And Article 15 on sharing of benefits reads, benefits resulting from any scientific research and its applications should be shared with society as a whole and within the international community, and then is added, in particular with developing countries, or as I prefer to say, in poor and low-income countries. And the second normative answer relates to the European Convention on Human Rights and Biomedicine, which states, I quote, affirming that progress in biology and medicine should be used for the benefits of present and future generations, stressing the need for international cooperation so that all humanity may enjoy the benefits of biology and medicine. So although this is a European Convention on Human Rights and Biomedicine, the convention states that all humanity may enjoy the benefits of biology and medicine, not only Europeans in the global north. And the third normative answer relates to a resolution that is quite recent, namely from last year, from September 11th, 2020. It was a resolution that the UN General Assembly's COVID-19, it is a resolution that was issued by the UN General Assembly on COVID-19. In this resolution, the special challenges and needs of the most vulnerable countries are recognized, and commitment to global solidarity are reaffirmed. And paragraph 12 of this resolution, which only the United States and Israel voted against, states, and I quote, urges member states to enable all countries to have unhindered, timely access to quality, safe, efficacious, and affordable diagnosis, therapeutics, medicines, and vaccines, and essential health technologies and their components, as well as equipment for the COVID-19 response. Then to my factual answers. First, there is a need for a sustainable ethics of benefit sharing because there exists a monstrous inequity in the world with respect to whose diseases and needs are favored in ongoing or planned research for health programs. We're going to talk about the so-called 1090 gap. The second factual answer relates to a dramatic outsourcing of clinical research to poor and low-income countries. Well, one might say, well, this is a consequence of globalization. Well, we shall look more thoroughly into that claim. And the third factual answer relates to the exploitative language of the so-called TRIPS regime. The TRIPS regime is a patent regime related to the development of drugs, for example, or vaccines. And on the webpage of the World Trade Organization, it is stated the following. The World Trade Organization members have to provide patent protection for any invention, whether a product such as a medicine or a process such as a method of producing the chemical ingredients for a medicine, while allowing certain exceptions. Patent protection has to last at least 20 years from the date the patent application was filed. Now, in the midst of the COVID-19 pandemic, this patent regime has shown how dangerous it is when it comes to the rights to health, the rights to care, the rights to access drugs for poor and low-income countries. There is also an historical answer. Old Europe and the US have a lot to atone for vis-à-vis countries in Africa, in Asia, and Central and South America. The sustainable ethics of benefit sharing may represent one way of healing some of the historical wounds of exploitation, injustice, and crimes against humanity. I will now move further and illustrate with 3 case stories the challenges ahead and how far there is still to go. The first story relates to the so-called globalization of clinical research. And I will present some of the findings in a paper that was published in one of the most prestigious medical journals in 2009 by Glickman and co-authors. The title of the paper is Ethical and Scientific Implications of the Globalization of Clinical Research. In the paper, they pursued 2 questions. First, what has led to this dramatic shift in the location of clinical trials from the global north to the global south? Second, who benefits from the globalization of clinical trials? And they present several tentative answers. That is, answers they say are not definitive, but point in a specific direction. First, cost savings. That is, substantial cost savings may be achieved by moving phase 2 and phase 3 clinical trials to places such as Southeast Asia and South America. Second, time saving. Time costs accounts for 50% of costs to develop new drugs. And globalization of clinical trials may shorten the timeline for clinical testing and thereby the cost. That is, the pharmaceutical industry and the clinical researchers, by outsourcing clinical trials to poor and low-income countries, they save time. They can develop this in a shorter period of time and thereby also reduce the costs. Third, easier access to potential research participants in countries such as China and India helps to speed up the recruitment process. Fourth, fewer regulatory barriers in poor and low-income countries help to facilitate the conduct of clinical trials for pharmaceutical and device companies. Fifth, the rise in regulatory barriers and concomitant costs in wealthy countries speed up the outsourcing of clinical trials to poor and low-income countries. And some tentative conclusion. The so-called globalization of clinical trials during the last 20 years has substantially increased the number of people from poor and low-income countries enrolled in clinical trials. That is a fact. But the so-called globalization of clinical trials during the last 20 years seems not to have increased the availability of new drugs to populations in poor and low-income countries. Here is a figure that shows what kind of clinical trials have been outsourced and which health problems are given priority. And we see, for example, breast cancer is very high up on the axis, diabetes, heart diseases, while when we move down, we see that, for example, some of the diseases killing most people in poor and low-income countries are prioritized in terms of very few clinical trials, such as lower respiratory infections, diarrhea, low birth weight, malaria, etc. Third tentative conclusion, the so-called globalization of clinical trials during the last 20 years may have substantially increased the gap between wealthy nations and poor and low-income countries with regard to who benefits from the advances of clinical research and development. I introduced this metaphor, the 10-90 gap. This metaphor was introduced during the General Health Assembly of WHO. I think it was in 1996. And it was a metaphor to indicate that 90% of all resources for medical and health-related research are used to study ailments affecting the 10% most affluent part of the world's population, which means that for the rest, that is the 90% rest of the world's citizens, only 10% are used for medical and health-related research. And in spite of the fact that since 2009, there has been a dramatic outsourcing of clinical trials to poor and low-income countries, there are little indications that this gap has been changed in the right direction. That is, that more resources now are used to study ailments affecting the most vulnerable parts of the global city. The second case story relates to the TRIPS regime and the problem of access to essential medicines. And we are also going to see how this looks like from the vantage point of COVID-19 vaccines. Who benefits from the so-called TRIPS regime, the patent regime for developing new drugs and vaccines? Well, Thomas Pogge, highly respected philosophers from the United States who have written a lot and worked a lot on global justice, he identified 4 main affected groups when it comes to this regime. First, the pharmaceutical industry and their researchers and shareholders. Second, actual and future patients in the global. Then generic manufacturers of medicine, and actual and future patients in poor and low-income countries. He said, okay, let's take a look at this patent regime and what it implies for these 4 different stakeholders. And certainly the first group, the pharmaceutical industry and their researchers and shareholders, they benefit grossly from the global enforcement of this regime. The effect on the second group, on the other hand, that is actual and future patients in the affluent part of the world, it's less clear how they benefit from this patent regime. And then the third group, that is the part of the pharmaceutical industry that produce copy medicines. For example, India is the biggest producers of copy medicines in the world. And because of the horrible impact of the COVID-19 pandemic in India, much of this industry is in jeopardy because people working there are affected and dying from this pandemic. And Nate Green, in an article published in 21, 5th of March, says, despite the push from activists, high-income country support did not materialize for South Africa and India's proposal to waive intellectual property protections on COVID-19 vaccines and treatments at this week's World Trade Organization's General Council meeting. Well, about 10 days ago, to our big surprise, President Biden decided to provide some kind of support to South Africa and India when it comes to waiving the patent regime related to COVID-19 vaccines. But we do not know for the time being the results of this gesture, pragmatic gesture from Biden. So what Pogge says that for generic manufacturers of medicine, the TRIPS regime represents a substantial infringement upon their possibilities of producing cheaper versions of patented drugs and vaccines. And that is exactly the situation in India and generic manufacturers of medicines in India now during the COVID-19 pandemic. So what about the fourth group? For the fourth group of stakeholders, most in need, the TRIPS regime is socially harmful, says Pogge, in a dramatic way. And I quote from his article, "Millions of deaths from AIDS and other treatable or curable diseases are due to the suppression of manufacture and trading of generic drugs." Some tentative conclusions. The TRIPS regime represents an initiative from democratic governments in the affluent parts of the world enforced upon the global community. And I think it's due time to state that these governments should be held accountable for lending support to gross human rights violations in the name of medical and health-related research. Second tentative conclusion, the market economic language of the TRIPS regime gives voice to the medical interests and needs of the most powerful inhabitants of the global city, and notably at the cost of essential medical needs of millions of the poorest inhabitants of the same city. Third case story. What happens when a disaster arrives? This is a paper that was published in Science on September 12, 2014. And the aim of this study was to try to find out how did the last Ebola outbreak start. Together with this scientific paper, a small additional paper was published in the same issue of Science, Ebola's Heavy Toll on Study Authors. Science, together with Nature, are probably the two most prestigious scientific journals in the world. And I will quote some statements in this study. In an ongoing public health crisis, the author says, where accurate and timely information is crucial, new genomic technologies can provide near real-time insights into the pathogen's origin, transmission dynamics, and evolution. Yeah, that is a fact. In March 2014, they continue, Kenema Governmental Hospital established the Ebola surveillance in Kenema, Sierra Leone, near the origin of the 2014 outbreak. And they continue, on May 25th, the Kenema Government Hospital scientists confirmed the first case of Ebola in Sierra Leone. Investigation by the Ministry of Health and Sanitation uncovered an epidemiological link between this case and the burial of a traditional healer who had treated Ebola patients from Guinea. Tracing led to 13 additional cases, all females who attended the burial. So why were they infected? They were infected because the old burial tradition in these countries is that you have to take a physical farewell with the deceased by embracing him or her and giving him or her a kiss. And because the Ebola virus is so infectious, 13 women who participate in this burial also were infected by this horrible disease. Then the last quote, and I pay particular attention to this quote, which I have italicized. We obtained ethical approval from the Ministry of Health and Sanitation, the Sierra Leone Ethics and Scientific Review Committee, and our US institution to sequence patient samples in the United States according to approved safety standards. In total, we generated 99 Ebola genome sequences from 78 confirmed Ebola patients, representing more than 70% of the Ebola patients diagnosed in Sierra Leone from late May to mid-June. Our data suggests that the Sierra Leone outbreak stemmed from the introduction of 2 genetically distinct viruses from Guinea around the same time. All subsequent diversity in Sierra Leone accumulated on the background of those 2 lineages, consistent with the epidemiological information from tracing contacts. Then some factual observations about this study. 50 co-authors were involved in the study. And in the paper, it is stated, these authors contributed equally to this work. But in spite of this claim, it is the fact that both first authorship was granted to 2 researchers from Harvard University. And we know that in medical and health-related research, the 2 most important places for authors is to be either the first author or the last author. The last author is the corresponding author. That is the author that communicates with the scientific journal and the editors of the scientific journal where the paper is published. So why the heck, if all 50 co-authors had contributed equally, why were the 2 most noble places of co-authorship given to 2 professors from Harvard University? No consent was obtained from the 78 confirmed Ebola patients to collect samples from them and undertake genome sequencing of their samples. Additionally, 5 of the local collaborators were, after they had deceased, honored with co-authorship. 4 of these had collected the samples and they were infected by the Ebola virus and they died. The 5th one had a stroke. In spite of the claim that these 5 contributed equally to the study, it is evident that they were not granted with the same level of protection as their collaborators in the study from the United States, for example, the 2 researchers from Harvard University. And the authors, the 2 researchers from Harvard University, they even had the guts to publish a paper in the same journal with photos of the 5 deceased local collaborators. This brings me to some critical questions. Is this study a paradigmatic example of responsible conduct in research? Is this study a paradigmatic example of collaborative international research? Or is this study an unfortunate example of the opposite, that is, collaborative injustice? And is this the study that should have been given priority, taking into account the Ebola situation in Sierra Leone from late May to mid-June 2014? This study had no health relevance whatsoever, but from a basic research point of view, certainly it was an interesting study. 3 additional questions. Is collaboration in international medical and health-related research a reality or just a wet dream? Is collaboration in international medical and health-related research a disguised form of subtle exploitation? And is the language of international medical and health-related research cross-cultural or unicultural? I think it is right to say that what the world is experiencing today and what is happening in international medical and health-related research is a new form of exploitation, is a new form of colonialization, is a new form of robbery of precious resources in the global south. It is an irony from nature that some of the cost-poorest countries in the world are some of the richest countries in the world with regard to biodiversity. And what we see now is a race by researchers from the global north to the global south to identify plants, microorganisms that can be used to develop new treatment options, new medicines. So they fly in, they use their genome sequencing technique, identify these plants, they fly back to their laboratories, and then they request the right to patent what they have found. This is a new kind of gold rush. This is a new kind of colonialization. This is a new kind of exploitation, but and to a much greater extent than ever in the history of mankind, but in seemingly much more subtle ways. I found this publicity in a magazine when I was flying with United Airlines some years ago. And I think what is stated in this publicity says something about the current situation in international medical and health-related research. You will not get what you deserve. You will get what you negotiate. This brings me to the question about the TRIPS regime, the question about equitable access to medicines and drugs, now during the time of COVID-19. And it brings me back to this UN General Assembly COVID-19 resolution from September 11th last year. And I quote again what is stated in this resolution: urges member states to enable all countries to have unhindered, timely access to quality, safe, efficacious, and affordable diagnosis, therapeutics, medicines, and vaccines, and essential health technologies and their components, as well as equipment for the COVID-19 response. And I have emphasized timely access, because when we talk about equitable access, it is not just that everybody, all citizens of this planet should have access, equitable access to vaccines, but they should have access to these vaccines at the same time. And that is not the case. What has happened since September 11th, 2020, since this resolution was issued? Trump is gone, but his political buzzword, America First, seems to have infected the minds of political leaders in the global north. Because these countries hoarding of billions of doses of COVID-19 vaccines to secure full coverage for their own populations represents a radical U-turn from their position expressed in the UN General Assembly COVID-19 resolution. The US alone has an agreement with Pfizer for 600 million doses, with Moderna for 100 million doses, and with AstraZeneca for 300 million doses for its citizens, while AstraZeneca's COVAX commitment stands at 170 million vaccines, and Pfizer's and Moderna's commitment is only 40 million vaccines for distribution to 92 countries. In the words of Angela Devon, a few months after the sweet talk during the UN General Assembly on global solidarity, the vaccines have arrived and solidarity has frayed. What is vaccine nationalism? The affluent nations hoarding of the majority of COVID-19 vaccines that will be produced during the next 2 years does not deserve the label vaccine nationalism. These are acts pretty close to crimes against humanity. That is, acts that are purposely committed as part of a widespread or systematic policy directed against civilians in time of war or peace in a furtherance of a state policy. Most affluent countries have developed a priority list with regard to which groups should be first vaccinated. First, COVID-19 frontline healthcare workers. Second, elderly people, and then individuals with certain comorbidities. These are priorities based on the epidemiological knowledge gathered so far concerning the impact of the SARS-CoV with infection and on justified moral reasoning. If this is the medical and moral truth within the borders of affluent countries, why is it not converted into a universal policy of benefit sharing? That is a health policy addressing the needs of all inhabitants of the global city, not solely the privileged ones. We know two crucial things about the prognosis of this pandemic. First, the earlier the same priority groups worldwide get access to COVID-19 vaccines, the lower the global death toll and the faster the pandemic will end. That's the reason why in the UN General Assembly resolution, timely access was emphasized. Second, the affluent countries' vaccine nationalism will probably increase the number of mutant variants of the SARS-CoV coronavirus, with consequences of a possibly detrimental kind for all mankind. This virus does not respect national borders. The Director General of the WHO, Tedros Adhanom Ghebreyesus, describes vaccine nationalism, and I quote, as a catastrophic moral failure, a catastrophic moral failure. And it continues, we will only truly end the pandemic if we end it everywhere at the same time, which means it's essential to vaccinate some people in all countries rather than all people in some countries. It is due time that the most affluent countries in the world truly acknowledge their commitments made to poor and low-income countries in October 2005, when the Universal Declaration on Bioethics and Human Rights was adopted by acclamation by the General Conference of UNESCO. And in September 2020, when the UN General Assembly resolution was issued, that is, of making sure that the most vulnerable inhabitants in every country will be first in line when it comes to vaccination and treatment against COVID-19. That is what equitable access means. It is everybody should have access to the vaccines, and those on the highest on the priority list should have access at the same time. That is both what epidemiological knowledge tells us and what justified moral reasoning tells us. But that is not the situation. I see, for example, my country, Norway, has hoarded the market, has bought up more vaccines, twice the whole population in Norway. Canada, I think, has bought around 5 times their population, the same in the United States, the same in the most affluent countries, which means that there will not be available vaccines for the majority of inhabitants of this planet within the next 2 years. And that will have detrimental consequences, not only for people living in these countries, but it will also spread to the rest of the world, because this virus will continue to live. Mutants will continue to develop because of this moral catastrophe that the affluent part of the world has inflicted on the rest of the world because of its greediness. 3 claims about international medical research. There is a need of grounding our duties in international research within a broader normative framework of social, distributive, and rectificatory justice. There is a need for a human rights-based approach in international health research. There is a need to do research fairly in an unjust world. There is a need to change dramatically this picture to something that has at least a faint impression of some kind of global justice. Well, before ending this presentation, I would like to share with you a song entitled All Will Be Fine, because I think the vision and the longing expressed in this song resonates with some of the topics we have addressed in today's lecture.